When Hailey first dropped into the game all the way back in August, she absolutely shook up the Colossus killing meta, bringing some insanely fast kills and making opening materials for parts so much easier. With the red mods now a part of the game though, and more specifically her cluster shot mod, she's now not just the master of boss encounters, but also makes the list for best ad clearers in the game. In this video we'll be having a dive into how to set your Hailey up correctly, looking at what modules you need, what gear you should be rocking, the weapons that work best with her, and even a cheeky interaction with a lesser used component set, bumping her damage just that much higher. With all that out of the way though, what are we waiting for? Might as well get straight to it. Perfect, so we're actually going to go straight into the modules. Now I'm going to do the builds a little bit different. I'm actually going to be building it right in front of you, and I'm going to explain every single one of those choices so you understand why they exist in here. Now, obviously you can put in any of your sub-attack modules that you want to here. I personally prefer mid-air maneuvering, but feel free to be able to slot in what you want. And ideally you do want to be able to drop a catalyst in here. That does give you the extra module capacity. But what we're actually going to be doing is we're going to be looking into a red mod first, and then we'll build the rest of it around it. Now, the reason why Cryogenic Cluster Shot is fantastic here is that essentially what it does is it changes your skill 1, which used to be a dimension skill, and all it kind of did, it didn't do anything for really mob clearing unless you actually powered up the skill power modifiers and you actually built into skill power and everything. What it used to be able to do is it would just essentially lock onto up to 9 monsters, it would apply its damage, and then essentially every single time you hit it, whether it was a skill attack or whether it was with a weapon, you would do an additional 50% of that damage, and this would last up to 12 seconds on that enemy. Now what it does though is if you apply this, it changes it over to a singular ability, so you won't be getting the damage or the cooldown from multi-talented from spamming this ability anymore, which is a bit of a shame, but you know, it is what it is. But on top of that, it does increase the amount of damage that the ability would originally do, so this is now up to 119.7%, but what it has done is it's reduced the additional damage down from 50% all the way down to 25%, and now it's applying an AoE effect every single time you land that shot on an enemy. So this is going to do a burst damage of 178.8% in a radius of 3 meters, which can be expanded all the way up to 7.5 meters in this case, and the max stacks that you can have on one single enemy is going to be 3. So that's just something you do need to be able to keep in mind. It means that we're not going to be reducing their action speeds as much, because we'd have to get 3 casts of this ability to get up to 9 stacks, but now it's a case of we're able to do AoE damage for clusters of enemies, and we're going to be applying a buttload of damage basically with this. So this is what makes it such an effective mob dealer. It makes it so the reduction from 50 down to 25% in terms of additional damage does kind of hurt it, but it is still more than enough to be able to actually make up for the mobbing potential of this mod. So what we need to be able to do is kind of build ourselves around this skill 1, because the main kind of gameplay loop that's going to be happening with Hailey is we're going to be activating our skill 3, we're going to be setting ourselves up, so we do have that 40% increase to our firearm critical hit rate, we do have that 40% into our skill critical hit rate, and being able to go into both is fantastic for this, because that means that we're going to be using our guns to be able to do so much damage, but we're also going to be using the skill critical hit rate massively here, because when this actually procs and this does the explosion damage, you can get that to crit, and that does mean that we can build really nicely into critical hit damage with Hailey, and that is going to apply so much damage to basically everyone that's kind of caught in that radius. So ideally what we want to be able to do is actually start building into Hailey in terms of like generic stuff around her build. So the first thing that we want to be able to do is build into range. Now if we do go into range, ideally what we want to do is go into as much as possible without hitting the cap, because the cap does go at 7.5 meters. If we do go for something like maximize range and being able to go into skill expansion, this actually gives us too much range. We don't want to go into something like that, so what we want to be able to do is go into skill expansion, but we also want to go into amplification control. This does then put us at just under that 7.5 meter range, but essentially that 0.2 meters is just kind of like neither here or there. You can get away with that, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. So this is more than enough range for what we actually need this to be able to do, and this will allow us to hit as many enemies as possible. Now of course we need to be able to stay upright. The main drawback to her skill 3 is the fact that it makes us walk really slow. Obviously once we're at max stacks we are essentially just kind of like a walking tank, and we essentially need the HP to be able to make sure that we stay in that fight. So what we want to be able to do is we want to grab some HP modules. Now I would highly recommend that you do go for increased HP, and I would also grab Stim Accelerant as well, and this is going to give us a huge amount of HP. As you can see, it's going to times us by 452.5%, That is going to be pretty much all we kind of need. So you can see that we're just kind of shy of 19k HP, and this is really, really nice. This allows us to be able to actually deal with mobs. This allows us to be able to tank some hits, and essentially as we're mowing our way through enemies, because we are chucking out so much DPS, we'll essentially be able to pick up all those HP modules to be able to get us back up to full HP as we need and as we see fit. So this is essentially all we kind of need in terms of survival. We don't really need any kind of like defense increases or anything like that. This is more than enough, and this essentially just see you all the way through. Now, of course, we are going to be spamming our abilities, and that's essentially going to be the case with our skill 1, so we essentially need a buttload of cooldown. To be able to go full cooldown, obviously the main kind of combination that people do go for is going to be Nimble Fingers as well as MP Conversion. Being able to put that on there essentially brings us down to a 3-second cooldown, which is really, really nice, and that allows us to be able to spam it against bosses, it allows us to be able to spam it against mobs, everything like that. Essentially, when we actually need this ability back, we'll essentially have it, and that is fantastic. So that is essentially the mods that we need there. And of course, we did mention the critical damage and being able to go for crit rate as well. So we do want to be able to go for our skill insight and our skill concentration, and this will give us the most amount of increase to both of those sides of things in terms of crit rate and crit damage, without being able to like sacrifice one or the other. This essentially gives us the highest amount of boost just for 2 mods that we are going to be slotting into this build. Now this just leaves us 2 spots left over. Now originally we used to be able to go into like crits and everything like that with Hailey, but we are missing out on skill power currently. Now because of the addition of extra amplification and integration mods that we did have, essentially what we're now looking to be able to do to really maximize out the amount of skill power that we're going to be putting out is we are going to be using power increase here, and then on top of that we are going to be going into chill, and we're going to be picking up chill integration. Now the reason why we've gone for integration rather than going for amplification is because we don't want to hurt the amount of critical hit damage that we're going to be doing. Now I do love the amplification mods, but unfortunately that 140% is basically hurting us more than what we're actually adding with our original modifier, which is going to be our skill concentration. So therefore I don't really want to destroy everything that we have when it comes to crits, because we are planning on basically critting left, right and center pretty much 100% of the time. So I do want to keep my critical hit damage quite high, but if I add in the chill integration, this will give us chill skill power, which gives us additional buckets, which is what helps with power increase as well as going into chill skill power, but it's also going to be boosting up our critical hit damage by an additional 10%, really kind of helping us out in that area. Now I do kind of wish that the chill skill power was a little bit higher in terms of that number, but I'm getting essentially 2 bucket loads of skill power into this build, so I think that's more than enough, and that essentially allows me to be able to get the damage numbers that I'm doing. So I'm going to be getting a buttload of skill power, I'm also increasing our critical hit damage, and that's essentially working in tandem with these 2 mods right here. So that wraps it up for the modules, that wraps it up for the main bread and butter when it comes to this build. So that allows us to be able to swap over to the rest of the gear. So if we actually head on over, the next thing I want to talk about is going to be our reactor. Now I do not have a best in slot with reactors, but that's where purples actually do work really nicely here, allowing us to be able to swap back and forth between weapons, because as you can see here, I am holding an Albion cavalry gun, and I am holding an Enduring Legacy, and I'll explain the reasons as to what I need those guns for, but essentially there are going to be a couple of times where we're going to want to swap back and forth between weapons, and being able to have a purple reactor allows us to be able to do that without sacrificing anything into skill power. Now to be able to go into this one, we have gone for a frozen singularity, because that allows us to get the most amount of damage from our chill, but it also gives us an additional boost into our singular, and as I recall with the module side of things, because of our skill 1 being swapped over to singular, we're now getting essentially that power boost into the actual damage that that's going to be dealing. So therefore we want a frozen singularity for basically for this build. So chill singular is fantastic, essentially meeting the optimization condition is perfect here, and then essentially after that, in terms of the ratios, you want to be able to find a combination of different kind of rolls. Essentially anything that's either chill or singular ratios is fantastic. Skill critical hit damage is fantastic as well, because we're going to be essentially critting all the time, and additionally on top of that you could look for a roll into skill cost. Now the reason why this one doesn't necessarily crop up too much is because we are going to be using her skill 3 pretty much all the time, and being able to reduce the amount of continuous MP draw that's going to have is going to be fantastic. It gives you a longer uptime, it essentially allows you to be able to keep this ability longer for essentially active for longer, and that's what really kind of helps with this build. I'd love to be able to say that I could put a skill kind of cost into this one, but unfortunately it just kind of sacrificed too much in the build. But if you do find one as a ratio in terms of your reactor, as well as a way to increase the amount of damage, then that's still a great roll well, and I definitely would recommend it for here. Now, if you are going to be using a legendary reactor, ideally you would want to be using a general rounds one. I would recommend that you have one that has either an Albion cavalry gun or an enduring legacy fitted into there, and then if you're able to add an additional one on top of that, basically essentially add the other one in. The reason why is because our Albion is going to be our mobbing gun, and then our enduring legacy is going to be our fallback bossing gun, and I'll explain a little bit more when we get to the weaponry side of things. So now that we've covered reactors, we can start working our way down on the right hand side. So we're now going to be visiting the components set. Now the best thing that I can recommend for you is going to be a 4-piece of the Polar Knight. The reason why is this kind of goes into everything that we kind of need the build to do. Essentially a 2-piece, this has given us additional chill skill power, which really helps out with the rest of the buckets, which we did talk about with the module side of things. So it's going to increase the amount of damage we're going to be dealing, but on top of that, at a 4-piece, this does essentially give us a way of being able to get a buff and an additional way of being able to apply some AoE damage. Now, it does kind of trick you a little bit because it does say for each frostbite stack that's been inflicted upon enemies, essentially you get a chance of being able to get a buff. What it kind of doesn't say is the fact that even though Hailey essentially doesn't have anything on her kit that mentions it can do frostbite, there are ways that we can kind of trick the game into thinking that we are applying it. Now, the main one that we're going to be talking about is actually going to be applied on our Albion cavalry gun, but essentially how this one works is that when we get actually fully set up and we're essentially blasting away and everything like that, we're essentially going to be able to proc this kind of reliably, and what this will do is it will give us a chance of being able to get up to 10 stacks of an additional of 1.7% into our firearm critical hit damage, which means that we're going to do more damage with our actual weapon that we're using, and then on top of that it allows us to get up to, even at 10 stacks, up to a 60% increase to our skill critical hit damage, which is fantastic because that means that every single time of our skill 1 proccing, every time it explodes, and because we're going to be pretty much at 100% skill rate with our Cold Fury, essentially it's going to be exploding for even more damage, which is going to be great for softening up more targets. It's going to be great for working on bosses. It essentially allows us to be able to melt some actual kind of enemies that are in front of us, and that essentially works really nicely with this build. It is fantastic. On top of that, if you do defeat an enemy while frostbite is afflicted, it doesn't tend to come into it very often, but being able to get out to an additional 12.2% of your max HP as an additional kind of explosion at a 30% chance is great. That's why we do also have our HP as high as possible, because that allows us to be able to do even more damage. But to be honest with you, we are essentially just focusing on that first part. The second part doesn't come into it too often, but it is still a very nice kind of bonus to come from it. Now, in terms of roles of what you're looking for, you are going to be looking into MP recovery out of combat and max HP. When it comes to the sensor, you want MP recovery in combat and max MP. That's pretty much best in slot when it comes to your sensor. Polar Light memory, this is going to be either defense. You would like to be able to go for either another resistance or being able to get some MP recovery modifier. That would be quite nice here. Essentially, that shield recovery in combat is not really kind of helping too much when it comes to this build. And then lastly, when it comes to the last bit, a little bit, it doesn't matter too much, but essentially either resistance or increases to max shield, shield recovery, anything along those lines. The processor is probably the weakest part of these kind of sets, so anything along those lines just to increase your survivability would be fantastic. So weaponry wise, now we get to swap over to the main bread and butter as to what makes this so strong. Now, you will be primarily using the Albion cavalry gun now that it's been buffed for pretty much 99% if not 100% of the run, and then you will be swapping over to something like an enduring legacy, which is going to really benefit from those crits for against things like stubborn bosses, as long as there's no additional enemies that pretty much exist inside of that level with you. The reason why is because enduring legacy is a fantastic single target DPS gun, but it does absolutely nothing to be able to help you out when it comes to the mobbing, whereas the Albion cavalry gun is fantastic at being able to take down bosses, but it's also great for being able to take down the mobs that do actually spawn with them. So if you do have multiple enemies on screen, the Albion is the way to go, but if you do find a way, or you do find a window to be able to absolutely burst down some bosses, then enduring legacy is going to be the way forward. So let's start ourselves with the Albion cavalry gun. Now let's actually talk about its unique ability. This is why I recommend getting it up to 4 out of 4 in terms of like the actual unique ability level. And the reason why is because on hit it inflicts mark on an enemy. When you hit an enemy that has been inflicted with mark, it increases your critical hit rate by 30 which is fantastic. Essentially, it's just a flat 30%, which is great, but it also applies the buff to the attack, where each critical hit ricochets to nearby enemies, and it allows them to be able to be stunned by the ricochet effect. On top of that, holding down the trigger allows you to get horseshoe effect, which increases your movement speed, which essentially kind of counteracts what Cold Fury does. It's really interesting kind of like interaction that kind of exists in this game, where if you use Cold Fury to slow yourself down to be able to get that skill cost modifier, and then you also use your Inversion Reinforcement for the Archie Pacemaker, essentially you're able to kind of like run around at a decent speed, but Pacemaker still triggers, meaning that you do get the cost reduction while at the same time of being able to move around quite decently. So the Albion Cavalry Gun is a really nice fit to be able to go for Hailey in this case, and I do recommend that you do pick it up for that reason. Now, being able to apply Ricochet to targets, 3 targets, and then stun them for 4 seconds is fantastic. This essentially works really nicely in combination with all the crits. It works really nicely with what the Cryogenic Cluster Shot is doing to be able to slow down actions. You're essentially kind of like slowing down enemies in front of you from being able to shoot back, from being able to do any kind of action, and then you're applying this stun on top of it to other enemies that are also nearby. This is what makes you so tanky, makes you so durable, because we have high HP just in case something goes wrong, but essentially you won't be actually touched that much, because the amount of CC that exists in this build is fantastic. I don't think there is anything that kind of really comes close to it, except if you actually manage to kill. Maybe like Ajax if you do go for elite build or something like that. But essentially it just allows you to hold down the trigger, move at a decent speed, and at the same time be able to stun and actually crit your way through every single kind of horde or every single enemy that does exist in your way. Now, this ricochet and the stun effect only apply if you do land that critical hit, which is why it's so vital, it's so important that we do actually go into Cold Fury with Hailey. It's why we're actually going to be picking up the 30%, which you do get from actually getting to unique ability level 4. And then we're also going to be doing the exact same thing with the modules, and I'll explain everything all in due course. So let's actually swap over to the modules, and I'll explain every single choice. Now, this one is purely a build for Hailey. I would recommend that you do build it slightly differently if you do go for a different kind of firepower build, but essentially the main kind of change that's going to happen is inside focus is just enough critical hit rate that is essentially going to give you 100% uptime or 100% critical hit rate with everything that kind of adds all together, that you essentially, if you go into something like edging shot, you will essentially have too much critical hit rate and you will essentially be hindering yourself. So that's why we have gone for that, to just be able to kind of like offset that, and that allows us to be able to get what we need. So the main thing that we are going to be focusing here is going to be increases to firearm attack, because that affects what the ricochet damage is going to be doing. On top of that, we are going into critical hit damage, so we do have things like better concentration, concentration priority, better insight to increase the amount of critical hit rates that we do get. We are also going to be increasing the magazine size with expand weapon charge. This allows us to get up to 111. I do have a roll on the gun as well, which is contributing to that, but 111 is a fantastic mag size. I do wish it was a little bit bigger, but you know what, I'm okay with that for what this weapon is actually doing. And then lastly, when it comes to the kind of like the main kind of mods, when it comes to fire rate and everything like that, sharp precision shot is here to be able to trigger the additional fire rate, so we are able to get even more fire rate on top of what our fire rate concentration is doing. But we are also going to be increasing our firearm attack that way. It's reducing recoil, which is great. It allows us to be able to stay a little bit accurate even if we're firing from the hip, which is fantastic. But the real kind of thing that kind of like shines here is going to be chill enhancement. Now, the reason why we do have chill enhancement on here instead of any of the other elements is that not only does this also apply an additional damage when it actually does the ricochet and everything like that, so it's a great way of being able to increase your DPS, but the chill attack is what actually triggers the frostbite, and that's what triggers into the Polar Knight set, which allows us to be able to get those buffs for even more critical hit damage from our skills as well as our firearm. So you kind of do need to have chill enhancement in here. It doesn't make too much sense if you do go for a generic or general kind of like firepower build, but if you are purely rocking Hailey and you are going into that Polar Knight set, I highly recommend that you do put chill enhancement in here, and that allows you to be able to increase your DPS, but at the same time also works really nicely with that component set. Now, the last thing I do want to talk about is going to be our Inversion Reinforcement. Now, I do know that the season is going to be changing in around about 20 days by the looks of things, so, you know, use this and abuse this while you still can. Obviously, if this does actually change in Season 2, then I will try and do an updated one, or I'll leave a pinned comment down below so we actually can get the best kind of Inversion Reinforcement kind of setup for yourselves. But ideally with this one, while you can build it a few ways, I do think that the best setup is currently what's shown on screen. Ideally, you do want to go for biodensity in your tree. Essentially, this will increase the amount of max HP that you do have. This will also increase the amount of damage that you will be triggering if you do trigger that second part of the 4-piece set for the Polar Knight, which is fantastic. It's also going to be helping you in terms of like incoming damage, which is great. In the recovery tree, we do want to go for selective neurostimulation. This one is going to be a great way of being able to increase the amount of MP that you will be receiving while you are slowly walking around. It just essentially is a great way of being able to try and maintain that Cold Fury as long as possible, and it's just an overall a great mod to just kind of like pick up here. And then lastly, the best in slot is probably actually going to go to the Archy Pacemaker, which we've already discussed a little bit, but essentially once your movement speed is 300 or less, it grants the buff, essentially reducing your skills cost by 25%. Now it does also reduce your effect range by 5% and your fire rate by 5%, but these are negligible considering that the 25% works really nicely with Cold Fury, and it also works really nicely with your skill 1, considering we're trying to spam that out as much as possible to increase our DPS. But that pretty much wraps it up on the build, and while this is slower than Freyna with her currently overtuned mob clearing abilities, and let's be honest, no other Descendant is close to touching her in regards to that as it currently stands, this is still an absolutely solid Hailey build focusing on mobbing, allowing her to run in 400% with ease and absolutely wreck house. So if you've not picked her up for a red mods just yet, now is the time to do so. But this is the section I want to hear from you. How are you still finding the first Descendant? Are you looking forward to Season 2? And what are your thoughts on jiggle physics making their way into the game soon? Let me know all that and more down below. Massive thank you for making your way to the end of the video, and as I always say, keep yourself safe, keep yourselves well, and I'll see you all on our next video.